I'm Dr. Fred Patterson. I'm an Associate Professor for Sustainable Business and Clean Growth at the University of Derby. As I said to one or two colleagues right at the start, as we were introducing, I don't really know anything about the procurement world, so this will be as much an education for me as it will be for you this morning. As well as being an academic and a researcher and a teacher, I'm involved in our MSc in Sustainable and Ethical Business Management. I run our Low Carbon Business Network at the University of Derby, which has around 170 individual members, business members, and therefore a few more actual people. So we're up towards 200 people in the network. And I also lead our Decarbonise business programme, which is part of a wider programme which we run with the Derby City Council and Derbyshire County Council and our Institute for Innovation and Sustainable Engineering. And that's a grant-giving programme, as well as providing support for product development and business improvement development, which is the bit that I'm in particular in charge of. So you can see kind of my remit is very squarely focused on support for SMEs. So the perspective I'm giving you today, following kind of conversations with Debbie, who very kindly did a presentation to our Low Carbon Business Network a little while ago, it comes from that perspective of how we support SMEs. And our whole purpose within the business network is really to support businesses, but in particular, how do we help businesses tap into the supply chains around them from larger organisations like universities, corporate organisations, councils, etc. So I spend most of my time doing all of that kind of stuff, and have a good relationship with Denise China and the procurement team at the university, who's on the call today. Thank you for being here, Denise, as a Derby supporter for this presentation. But yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. So what I want to cover this morning is just to say a little bit about our approach to net zero. We have what we call a net zero pathway. That's a term that's becoming quite popular around the whole agenda of the race to zero. The United Nations have a massive scheme called the Race to Zero, and this language around a net zero pathway, I think, is becoming quite common in all sorts of settings and organisations. I'll say a little bit about how that plays out for the University of Derby, and I'll go on to say something more about the enablers and barriers in terms of progress, in particular for SMEs, and some of the interesting stuff around what we know about SME maturity, around where they're up to in this whole transition to net zero. So I hope you'll find it interesting. And as ever with these things, I kind of believe that the cross-fertilization, cross-disciplinary insight around this is often really fruitful, and there will be unforeseen benefits from this kind of engagement. So I hope it's useful to you. So the chart that you can see here really just is trying to, in a very quick summary, show you the kinds of things that the University of Derby are doing to support the general pathway to net zero. So this is in the centre. You'll see the kind of inside the red circle. You'll see some of the things that we're involved with from a corporate angle, and the things around the outside are our activities for student learning, but also our engagement with stakeholders across our region and beyond. So we have student learning modules, courses, programs around things like sustainable business, building, sustainable business, engineering, the natural environment, health and well-being, a whole set of activities which are broadly focused on leadership across our region. So, for example, we have set up a Derby City Climate Change Commission and a project to reimagine what the city might look like if we incorporate all sorts of additional initiatives, greenways and blueways in the city, and helping the city to think about what a city of 2050 might look like. using technology and so on. In the centre there, you'll see, I mean, at the heart of our activity, we now have what we call one of 6 pillars is our zero carbon pathway, and also an environmental strategy steering group, which I'm involved with, and that has been increasingly driving activity. From a procurement point of view, and Denise may well say something about this a bit later, we have. I guess many of you will be party to schemes like the Net Positive Future scheme, which is trying to support the procurement team to engage with suppliers in a way that encourages both the university and those suppliers to become increasingly low carbon and shift towards a sustainable economy and deliver on net zero targets. The other thing I'll mention, just related to this overview, next to the heading there, capability, is carbon literacy training, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But we believe that as a university, one of the important things that we need to do is to ensure that all staff, so this is not just teaching staff, but all staff are carbon literate, that we move towards a position where all of our students are carbon literate. And slightly kind of paradoxically, we've kind of been approaching this backwards, because we've started carbon literacy training with some of our external stakeholders, one of our big corporate companies locally, and a health trust, that we're working with them to engage their staff in this process. So a kind of a train the trainer, change implementation approach to carbon literacy training in external organisations, which we are just beginning to incorporate within the university's activity as well. So you can see, I guess one of the things I would just stress around all of this is that this whole agenda is a systemic. It has to be a systemic approach. Whether you're in procurement, or whether you're one of the teaching staff in the university, or whether you're engaged with external organisations. Any institution has to engage with other bodies and agencies and institutions. And at Derby, we try to take an applied approach. So our research around this all aims to be applied, but multidisciplinary, place-based, and at the same time trying to learn from the cutting edge. So we at Derby are partnering with the Finland Futures Foundation, for example, who are based in Turku in Finland, which is already a carbon neutral city, one of the few cities in the world which are further ahead on this pathway than most of the cities in our neck of the woods, and that we believe that to be a really important principle, that you look to where the cutting edge of practices in order that we can begin to move at greater pace and at greater scale to shift towards a net zero sustainable future. Debbie, I can't see any questions. If there are any questions that are firing up that are important to stop me, please feel free to stop me in my flow, and we pick up direct questions if it's appropriate.
Will do.
So this is just a small summary of one of the carbon literacy courses that are available to universities. This is highlighting the one produced by Manchester Met University. That there is an equally good one developed and delivered by our colleagues at Nottingham Trent University, who have been with Manchester kind of leading lights in this whole carbon literacy training and capability building initiative, which is a global initiative now. And this is just to say, whilst all of us might have our specialisms, this is a more generalistic, getting people onto the first rung, so that we have a common understanding of when we talk about things like net zero or low carbon or sustainable low carbon economies, and there's a whole set of jargon. I think there's a sensible belief that if we begin to kind of have a common understanding of all of this stuff, I think that's really helpful. So you'll see there in the Manchester Met toolkit, the content areas are all, very obvious and sensible, straightforward aspects of the training. So the science of climate change, understanding what carbon footprints are, what is a zero carbon world, what might that look like, how do we influence the world around us within our institutions, and what does it mean to take action? And the Nottingham-Trent University has a broadly kind of similar curriculum as well. These are great for getting staff on the same footing, starting with the foundations. And I would encourage you to talk to your colleagues at your own universities or institutions to find out whether there are already activities started in your institution around this, because these are well worth getting involved with. Why are we doing all of this? I like this this cartoon. It's quite stark in its representation of where we might be. We've just had an awful 18 months or more with COVID, and we know how difficult that's been. What this represents is the challenge, I guess, and this can seem quite daunting, I suppose, that we know that we're already battling with issues around employment and the knock-on effects of the pandemic. Whether we like to see it as a recession or something else isn't the most relevant thing. The big thing here is that the challenges of climate change over the next few decades may well dwarf what we've been through with COVID. And of course it will affect us in different ways, but it creates an imperative for us to act, and that the kinds of activities and changes that we have been getting used to around the pandemic are potentially not as large as the implications for us if we're going to avoid significantly negative climate change into the future. And we already know that climate change is affecting us with floods, wildfires, and poor air quality, and waste in the oceans and the rivers and so on. It's something that we're quite familiar with. It's not something now that happens on the other side of the world. When I first started in this arena, I would show a polar bear sitting on an iceberg that had melted and broken off the ice shelf. Whereas now we see the effects in floods and fires on the moors and all sorts of implications for us very close to home. This is no longer something that's happening at the edges of the world. It's happening with us now. And of course, climate change sits alongside the challenges to the environment, where we're suffering all sorts of loss in biodiversity, both on land and sea, and the challenges of deforestation, particularly in the rainforests, mean that actually the challenges of climate change caused by fossil fuel use has been exacerbated by the fact that our green wildlife and forests and oceans being compromised, means that adds to the pace of negative climate impacts. And it's worth reflecting. I don't know whether people saw, there was a programme a couple of weeks ago about the Climate Gate affair, where some of the climate scientists, there was a negative campaign due to some emails that were hacked, which was only in 2009, which was calling into question the nature, whether climate change was a thing and whether humans were the cause of it. So that, and Inconvenient Truth, the movie that Al Gore produced, won its Oscar in 2006, only 15 years ago. And at that point, we were still making the case that climate change was a thing. Many people understood that it was a thing at that point, but the case was still being made in the face of actions by governments and corporations in particular. And that's this is very short timescales in the kind of the hundreds of years that climate change has been building from the Industrial Revolution to 200 or 250 years ago. So things are moving really quickly now, and we know that. Bringing it back a little bit more locally, this is data showing the CO2 emissions across the regions, and just interestingly, given the group today, the East Midlands where I am and the North East where many of you are, and indeed Yorkshire and Humberside, are the top 3 regional emitters across the 9 regions of the UK, or of England, I should say. So it just adds I can have a special imperative for us to be acting, and that's a crucial part of the question we should all be asking ourselves in all aspects of not only our work life but our home life as well, I would argue. We're not short of policy. In advance of the COP26 conference, which we can't have avoided just in the last few weeks. The UK government released its net zero strategy to build back greener, and that promised to create 440,000 well-paid jobs and unlock £90 billion worth of investment by 2030. So we're not short of strategy. We've had emissions targets legislated for since 2008 in this country through our UK Climate Act. And the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution makes very clear cases for the type of action that businesses need to be doing, small and large. And the question will be, once again, about action. With these policy agendas in mind, many people will be saying the policy agendas don't go far enough. But even with the policy agendas, the Climate Change Committee, which oversees the progress of our the outcomes of our policy, in a September 21 report, has said that the initiatives so far planned in policy and the activities so far delivered are not taking us to the place that we need to be by 2030 or 2035. So there is more to do. This slide just sets out a definition of net zero, so we understand the terms that we're talking to. The definition of net zero, this is focused on companies, so it's about reducing all value chain greenhouse gas emissions in line with limiting warming well below 2 degrees C and ideally 1.5 degrees C. And that's been a focus of the COP26 conference over the last few weeks, which you'll have heard a lot about. The Race to Zero campaign, which you might hear me refer to, is a United Nations backed campaign which 733 cities, 31 regions, more than 3,000 businesses, and 622 universities around the world have signed up to. So that commitment to deliver a healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery that crucially prevents future threats whilst creating jobs and unlocking inclusive, sustainable growth. These are grand aspirations, and it's great that companies and universities and cities and regions are now on board with this. And I would urge you to see whether, find out if you don't know already, whether your university is part of that scheme or similar schemes, and to understand what the strategic implications are for your area of your organisation. And what that might mean going forward. So some of that's been a bit gloomy, and I think it's really important to remember that the future that we hope to create is a positive one, and part of the shift that we need to make, I think, in the kind of the dialogue around this is that actually what we're doing, this shouldn't simply be seen as an imposition and a whole set of compliance issues and negative challenges for organisations or your suppliers. It's about how are we going to redefine the world for the future? So by the time we get to 2030, 2035, 2050, what kind of world are we going to create? But we need to start now, because if we don't make the changes now, we're not going to be able to create the world by 2050 that will be comfortable to live in. We need to try and keep climate change below 1.5 degrees C. And doing that actually would create really positive environments for all of us to live in, much greener, cleaner air, healthier working environments that allow us to spend more time, with our hands in the earth, enjoying outdoor activities, as well as living in a more technologically innovative space. So let's get on to the businesses, and one of the interesting things here is this chart on the right is from a very recent survey by the British Business Bank of around 1,200 businesses. There's an awful lot of detail in it, but just to highlight the bar charts on the right, those charts show that SMEs, so just SMEs, contribute around 1/3 of total UK emissions. So the small suppliers that you're dealing with are making a significant contribution to emissions, and therefore can make a very big contribution to the shift towards a net zero economy. So even though individually their emissions may well be quite small as businesses, the small steps that they can take collectively, because 99% of businesses are SMEs, and I'm sure when you look at your portfolio of business suppliers, many of them will be small businesses, and these are the businesses that I deal with day in, day out. The same data suggests that SMEs contribute about half of business emissions. So that suggests that actually around 2/3 of emissions in the UK are from business. And one of the things that's quite interesting, if you look at the chart on the left, which is from BEIS, the Government Department for Business, Energy and Innovation, shows, it suggests there that business is 39%, residential 29%, but includes transport separately at 15%. Exports relates actually to energy exports. So those figures don't quite square up with the figures on the right, and I think that's a feature of the arena that, depending on who's creating the figures around who's creating what emissions, actually figures aren't always consistent. The most important thing, though, I think to take away from this is that those small businesses are a significant factor in the shift towards a net zero future. What this slide shows, on the right-hand side, this is a piece of work from Carbon Trust, which shows the percentage of emissions in different sectors. And it varies from sector to sector, and indeed within for businesses within those sectors. But essentially, what that shows is that tier 1 and 2 suppliers are contributing significant amounts of emissions within the supply chain. So for different sectors, it runs from between 50% and 90% or more of emissions are within the supply chain. So it's not simply within the operations of businesses that emissions are emerging from. And on the left, you've got a slide from some colleagues at JCB, which is a big local company in our neck of the wood, the digger company JCB. And they've worked out that 99.5% of their emissions are scope 3, i.e. emissions that exist within their supply chain rather than emissions that relate to their use of power or their operational functions. So it speaks to the importance of procurement in the solutions to climate change and reduction of emissions. So, when we begin to turn our attention to supply chain managers themselves, this is really interesting. So, 2 years ago, the UK committed to reducing emissions to net zero by 2050, the first nation in the world to do so, to legislate for that. 2 years ago, that was 2019. This survey done in 21 by SIPS, asking supply chain managers, shows that this was a survey of 318 supply chain managers. Only 59% believe that they will be able to deliver against net zero targets. So a significant proportion are not confident that things can turn around. 48% don't believe their organisation is transparent enough with either consumers, clients, or regulators about sustainability. And then 18% say they're completely unaware of corporate sustainability strategy at all. 19% weren't involved in their organisation's sustainability strategy where they had one. And 43% were only lightly involved. So when we think about, the role of procurement within this, there's clearly a lot more that can be done to bring it back to becoming a central pillar of that shift towards a net zero economy. We saw the importance of supply chains, but it seems here that supply chain managers still need a great deal more confidence that they can deliver against these kind of targets. And to influence their organisations much more strongly. Similarly, this survey was showing also that although just over half believes the planet is facing a crisis, which I don't know why they wouldn't, this was a survey of small businesses by the Federation for Small Businesses. Only around a third, 36% of small businesses have a plan to combat climate change. And I think that this is where the role of the procurement managers, supply chain managers of larger organisations begins to come into play. So while smaller businesses have taken steps to address energy usage, because that's obviously relates to costs. So the first thing a small business do will work on costs. They've got also got the message that recycling is good, partly because of increasing costs for waste in the business, so they're reducing those costs. Many fewer have themselves started to generate their own energy through solar panels and the like. So that's an area that businesses can begin to think about investing in for the future. But smaller businesses, due to their scale of finances and staffing, find that much more difficult, and therefore grants of the type that we offer smaller businesses in our Decarbonise programme are really important factors for that. So are there grant giving opportunities that can be pointed out to SMEs in the area? But very few are yet thinking about switching over to net zero emission vehicles. So there's an awful lot that businesses can do that are yet to get involved with. We found that around a third of, so similarly, the survey that we've done at Derby University, around a third of companies have put clean growth right at the heart of their strategy, which is an increase just in the last year or so. But around 45%, which also relates to the previous slide, have really just not considered or have already discounted clean growth as something for them. So there's, once again, we need to convince and support our smaller businesses that there are things that they can do, and there are many benefits for them to getting involved in net zero. And we also know this chart just shows on the left-hand column that the green bar at the top, 16% of smaller companies have put clean growth at the heart of their strategy, compared to 33 large companies on the right. So what that shows us is that large companies are much more confident in this area. It's the micro and small companies who need the greatest help to do this. And this chart, once again from the Federation of Small Businesses, is just showing the appetite for that transformation, and this is by region. So where we are in the East Midlands, we are by far and away the worst region in terms of SMEs appetite for that net zero. Yorkshire, Humber and the North East are slightly better than us, but once again not so good as many of the other English regions. So I guess what this is showing us is that, you know, not only do we know that SMEs have got a big role to play in this transformation, but they need more help and encouragement and support, and in particular in our own regions. Right, and that's what they're telling us. So in the East Midlands, Yorkshire and Humber, they're saying, please help us. The columns on the right showing these our regions are the regions that need the most help. Debbie, we've gone just over about half an hour now. How much longer do you want me to go on for?
No more than about another 5 minutes, please.
Okay, sure. I'll whiz through a few of these. So this complicated slide, this just illustrates what we do in Decarbonise. So there may well be schemes like this in your area, but we work with businesses to do a carbon audit. We identify where their emissions lie, whether they're in their energy use, whether they're in their operations or in the supply chain. We find out what the biggest lever to pull is and what it is that they can do most easily to create the biggest emission benefit. And you know, these type of schemes exist all over the country, which have to date been funded by the European Union, ERDF funding largely, and that will be changing as we move into the future as the UK funding streams begin to take off. So I would urge you to look to, you know, to what's happening in your own area. What we know about the kind of the barriers and enablers for SMEs in terms of kind of getting on board this shift to net zero. So this is a very recent study by our colleagues at Oxford University. And in terms of the internal barriers within the organisation, there are lots of familiar issues there that won't be surprised. Access to capital for change is obviously one that we often hear from businesses, but actually in our experience, it's less about access to capital and more to do with awareness and the constraints of having small staff with limited skills and awareness to do something like simple. You know, it's not a technically difficult thing to audit carbon, and there are many tools now that allow businesses to do that. So, you know, online tools that allow them to do that. It's often either the awareness or the time that small businesses just don't have to do the basics. So actually, where are we at with carbon emissions? And that's where schemes like ours come into play. If there aren't schemes like ours in your area, there is always the opportunity for businesses to kind of do it for themselves with the various online tools that are available to them. What we do know, though, is in terms of the drivers, is that both cost savings, but I would say the fourth bullet there in the top right corner of that chart, reputation is massive, and you see many of the smaller businesses we deal with shifting their business model based on a green reputation, and what they very commonly find is that they get new and more customers by positioning themselves as a green supplier. And that doesn't mean to say that they have all of a sudden shifted to be, like super green product or service delivery. It's about saying we're on a journey. So in some senses, it's relatively small steps to say we've started monitoring our carbon emissions. We've set out some initiatives to improve our carbon emissions, and usually it goes with some kind of green badge to say we're on that path, and that is a real boost to their sales. And more importantly, in the context of this meeting, that universities and other large organisations like councils, etc., are beginning to really take note of those badges and credentials in their choices about which suppliers they're choosing. This is a very stark figure. So on the right-hand side here, 3/4 of the world's biggest companies expect to deselect suppliers based on environmental performance. This is a survey of big international corporates, and I think for small businesses might be seen as quite scary. I think what it speaks to is a much more, having spoken with our procurement team, I know this is not the line that they would be taking, and I'm sure many of you would be the same, is that actually our councils, university, health trusts, etc., already take a much more kind of generous and supportive view than this. But it's something that small businesses need to be mindful of in a more carrot than stick point of view, is that actually the more they have developed their own green credentials, the more likely they are to succeed in their big local supply chains. I'll whiz through some of this stuff. I just wanted to share this with you, if you're not already familiar. There are some really kind of helpful benchmarks that provide science-based kind of targets, or apply to as much to universities as institutions and large organisations like ours, as well as they do for smaller organisations. And this SDG, Sustainable Development Goal benchmark tool, spells out to businesses really what 1.5 degree pathway looks like, and the things that they need to really be considering as their future goals in terms of operations, products and services, and the value chain. So this is just by way of saying that the benchmarks for this, although some of these may well be quite challenging, particularly for smaller businesses, actually the benchmarks and the pathways are really well marked out now. I'll not talk about this, too much to say. Finally, just to say, and this is to reiterate what I was saying before, in all of your areas, I think there will be initiatives, organisations that are there to support smaller businesses in particular, to do some of these things. And I think that balance between support and helping the smaller businesses get credibility, often through some kind of green badge or credentialing or standards, to say we are on this path, is a really important role for universities and other organisations to be supporting smaller businesses to get on that pathway. They don't need to have turned their business around in 1 year to be completely net zero. It's about being on a pathway, and for that to be recognised, particularly from a place-based angle. So what can we do as large organisations for our local small suppliers to help them get on the pathway, like we're doing as in our own organisations? We're on a pathway too. So I think there's one of the things I guess we've learned within our region is there's a family of supporting agencies, so which include things like the local enterprise partnerships and the growth hubs and the chambers of commerce and universities and council supporting initiatives. But it also includes the big buyers within that particular area. So universities and councils and big corporates, etc. We all have a role to play, and there's a little kind of, you can see the kind of the network map that we've created as part of our low carbon business network. That awareness of how we engage across our institutions to ensure, in particular when we're thinking about the North East, Yorkshire and Humber and East Midlands being very, at the bottom of that league table in terms of emissions and appetite and awareness. There is lots that we need to do in order to put our arms around this family of smaller, medium, larger businesses and corporate businesses, in order that our areas can fulfil the targets that we need to achieve to ensure that we keep climate change below 1.5 degrees C. And there are some contact details for me if people want to pick up later. We'll circulate these slides later, Debbie, I believe.
Yes, we will.
So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. I'm trying to take a more sort of practical approach to it. I've been through quite a substantial sort of knowledge growth on carbon reduction in the last 3 or 4 months. Previously to that, I avoided it like the plague because I thought it was technical and beyond me, but actually I found that it's a lot simpler than I thought it was. And there were a lot of tools out there that can help us in this scenario. So what I'm going to cover today is basically the drivers for carbon reduction, which I'll just skip through because I think we all know them. I'm going to go through the carbon reduction clause in the Sustained Code of Conduct, because we've now rolled that out to framework suppliers, and I know some of your universities are now utilising it with your supply chains. I'm going to have a look at the UK National Procurement Policy Statement because that has a section in it on carbon reduction. And then I'm going to start to look at some of the tools that we've got available to us. So, for instance, we've got the risk analysis by PROC-HE code. We've got the carbon reduction plan template and guidance for SMEs that was actually published a week last Friday as part of the last day of COP26. We published it via LinkedIn and it went out to all framework suppliers. Quick look at the UK UPC question and answer by SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, just to see what's on there. Then a look at the HE TOMs that I know that the Sheffield universities have been very involved in helping develop and what opportunities that gives us for measuring and evaluating carbon reduction initiatives. Finally, just to look at just to mention that obviously you can use the net positive action plan and also other useful resources. All the tools that we're going to discuss in here, I will circulate afterwards so that you've got your own copies all in one place, so that you're able to utilise them for your own uses and to share with your teams, and also, hopefully, get working together more closely with the sustainability teams as well. We did ask the EAUC to join this particular session today, but unfortunately they had a training day, so they couldn't make it. So we know, the basic drivers for carbon reduction. The COP26 agreement basically determined that we still weren't doing enough to minimise the risk of global temperatures rising by 1.5 degrees. And that 1.5 degrees, when you see some of the science behind it and you see some of the suggestions that what might happen if we don't actually succeed in this, we are talking about more and more flooding in the UK, as well as, in many other countries. And there is even a suggestion that whole, islands might disappear in the Pacific Ocean as a result of rising sea levels. So, there are concerns at home as well as overseas, and we really do need to tackle it. Obviously, as part of COP26 agreement, one of the things that governments have committed to doing is all to revise their carbon reduction plans by 2030. So they're going to revise what they've already done and try and ensure that they can deliver that 1.5 degrees, because the science is showing at the moment that their current plans won't actually achieve it. We also have the PPN05, which is the National Procurement Policy Statement, which we will mention later, but they are going to legislate to ensure that all contracting authorities do evidence that they consider the national procurement policy in all of their procurement activity. So that is obviously a driver for us to deliver government policy through our procurement activity. We've never quite had that before as the wider public sector, but it is just an evidence that the government doesn't believe they can do it all by themselves. They've got to encourage businesses to do it. And because we spend, in terms of contracting authority, our spend is huge in the UK economy, and so we have a great deal of influence. We also have a clause in the Sustain Code of Conduct, which is rolled out to the wider supply chains as well. So that's another thing that drives our activity on carbon reduction. We have stakeholder pressure. So we have pressure from our academics, we have pressures from our students' unions, we have wider community pressure, and from the wider public sector, from places like, the local councils and local initiatives as well, that all bring pressure to bear on us. Many universities have already set net zero targets for 2030. Some more have set it a bit later. But we do have ambitious targets within universities. One of the things to note, which I didn't really fully understand until I undertook this research, is that actually, very large suppliers, 36 million and over, they do have to report their emissions anyway under the reporting guidelines. And, we have heard the Chancellor talk about the fact that, they are going to legislate more to ensure that large companies don't greenwash their results in any way. So there will be increasing pressure from there. And PPN06 mandates that government departments must insist that they get carbon reduction plans as part of tender submissions under PPN 0621. Now, whilst that didn't apply to the public sector in any way, because carbon reduction is part of the National Procurement Policy Statement, by inference, we need to be driving it. And that's why, as part of the SME guidance, we have included a template carbon reduction plan. So this is what the Sustain clause is on carbon reduction. It was written pre-COP26 and pre-PPN 05 and 06, but it does, we have implemented this with our framework suppliers, our year 1 and 2 framework suppliers over the summer. We've had a 66% response rate. And if you think that many of our suppliers are SMEs, we have had quite a good feedback, and we are chasing the other suppliers up through contract management. So we are asking, we are reminding them that HE and FE institutions have ambitious targets, often specifying 2030, and we are asking the supplier to support the aim in reducing climate emissions impacts of their supply chain. And actually, when we start to talk about scope 3 emissions in particular, in terms of universities, your main focus of reducing scope 3 has to be through the supply chain, because it probably accounts for something in the region of 70 to 90% of your scope 3 emissions. So supply chain is where there should be much greater focus. And I'm sure as the sustainability teams and the estates teams, you know, sort of have done a lot of the quick wins within the campus, they will be turning their attention to working with you on the supply chains if they're not already. So we are asking suppliers to have clear and verifiable plans and actions in place. But obviously, you know, it has to be reasonable and proportion to the nature of the goods and services provided. You know, it isn't absolutely key for every organisation. It might not be relevant in some cases. So the UK National Procurement Policy Statement, which came out as part of PPN 06, talks about tackling climate change and reducing waste. There are 3 bullet points below it, and specifically it says contributing to the UK government's legally binding target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. So, you know, the aim was to be 45% of the way there by 2030. We look as though we're not going to hit that. So they will be revising some of the suggestions. I think we will see some greater legislation on carbon reduction as a result of COP26. And, you know, those targets are going to be ambitious, and we will need to support, you know, the government, the society, and our communities by actively working towards it. So I don't know how big this is on your screen. Can you see that at all, this risk analysis by Proc HE code?
We can scroll into it anyway, Debbie.
Oh, can you? Good, because it looks very small on my screen on a laptop. So the risk analysis by Proc HE code was basically something that came out of the HEPA RPG meetings a few years ago, and initially it was just it was a quick and easy sort of attempt to categorize suppliers by risk categories, and specifically initially it was on, you know, equality, environment, etc. But over the years it's been increased to include GDPR risk, the WEEE disposal risk for in terms of equipment, but recently we've added to it in terms of packaging waste, and also we've added to it recently, NEUPC undertook this work, which was to look at the HESCAT data and use that information that we publish every year. We calculate and publish every year, and use that data to come up with a risk rating against the Proc HE code. Now, I know that some of your universities don't all use Proc HE codes yourself, but you should be able to, you know, find the top level category and understand what category your particular item falls into. So this tool really is useful, you know, for category managers when they're doing their sourcing plans or their sourcing strategies, to have a look and see what the carbon risk is against their commodity, and determine, you know, whether the contract needs a strong focus on carbon reduction or not. But, you know, every little bit counts. So even if it says low in terms of carbon risk, you know, there may be things that the supplier can do to reduce anyway. So what I would say is these low, medium, and high it's an indication. It's probably not true for every commodity in that group, every single commodity in that group, but it's a quick and easy tool. And you know, really, you know, there may be some cases where you need to dig a bit deeper. So that's one tool that's available to you to help you determine whether carbon is at risk or there's an opportunity for carbon reduction. The next one is the UK UPC carbon reduction guidance that was actually published, as I say, a week last Friday. It has been sent out to every single framework suppliers for all of the consortia in the UK. So every framework that is supplied by a UK HE consortia, that supplier has got a copy of this guidance now. So hopefully, I mean, it may not have gone to the same person that you're talking to in your supply base, but that organisation should have a copy of it. And I will make sure that after the meeting today that you all get a copy of this document so that you can use it and share it with your local contacts as well. So in that particular guidance, our aim was to really focus on, you know, why it was important, obviously, to reduce carbon, why specifically the HE sector wants suppliers to commit to it, and also the benefits to them of having a carbon reduction plan, because it could save them money. It could help them meet information requests for their customers. It's good PR and good for reputation. And, you know, one thing that I think, you know, if we're thinking about employees these days, they want to work for organisations that they feel proud to work for. And, you know, they do consider whether the values of that organisation match their own values. So, and certainly the research into recruitment suggests that that's the case. So, for instance, you know, they would want to work for a company that reduced their carbon footprint. They may want to work for a company that allows them to reduce their carbon footprint by allowing remote working from time to time. We then look at ways to reduce the carbon footprint, and I'll show you some of those suggestions. They're very much the quick and easy ones. One or two of them obviously are more expensive if you're talking about things like heat pumps, etc. But a lot of them are fairly quick and easy ways to do it. And then we talk about the steps that they need to make in developing a plan. And I am going to show you some of the sources of information that they can use, because I think once you start to see some of the sources of information, you realise that actually it's not quite as difficult as we think it is. Then we have a suggested template action plan, which I haven't got on this slide set today, but it is based on PPN 0621. But what we're not asking them for at this stage is you know, for them to sign their lives away. It's we have to recognise that, you know, for SMEs in particular, it's a journey rather than a destination. And, you know, some of those choices that they make will be determined by, you know, the amount of funding they can get for it, or the amount of investment they have available to themselves to make the necessary changes. So very much trying to treat it for SMEs as a journey rather than, you know, a destination within a short space of time. And then finally, we've got at the back of that carbon reduction guidance, we've got useful resources, so various websites they can use, and also some key terms glossary. So, for instance, when we are talking about carbon reduction, we are talking about greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases really, you know, there are carbon dioxide, there's methane, there's nitric oxide, sorry, there's fluorinated gases. But we put it all together and we call it carbon, just because it's much easier for people to understand. So one of the first things that we do is we identify these scopes, which you'll probably recognise there. I'm sure that you all do it. And, you know, if you look at those scopes, basically scope 3 is primarily the supply chain, because it's nothing that belongs to you. And if you think about it, you know, universities have got some fleet, but they haven't got massive amounts of fleet. So, you know, a lot of the deliveries to your site are, you know, is actually adding to your carbon footprint as an organisation. So in order to measure them, basically, it should be fairly easy to do from your bills. So if you're looking at gas, for instance, and electricity, which is scope 2, you're looking at total kilowatt hours, which will be on your gas bill or electricity bill. Obviously, if you're looking at fuel, it's the amount that you purchase in litres or your vehicle mileage. Employee travel is a scope 3 emissions. So you can claim reductions in carbon if you reduce the amount of travel that your employees do. Things like water supply, water treatment, waste disposal. Now, obviously, water supply, you don't necessarily think that that's carbon reduction, but the energy required to clean water and to pump it around the system obviously does have an impact as well. And finally, the waste disposal, we are still generating a massive amount of waste in universities and at home as well. And, you know, that waste, you know, will produce methane if it goes into landfill. And also, you know, it's whenever you recycle something, that requires energy as well. So, you know, whilst a lot of people are sort of celebrating the fact that they've moved to recycle plastics, that's great, but every time you recycle it, that's a carbon footprint as well. You know, are there any other scenarios where you've got reusable packaging, for instance, instead of recycling, that possibly has a reduced carbon footprint? So basically, you would take your total suggested measurement and you times it by an emissions factor. Now, emissions factor, the standard ones that people seem to use are either the Carbon Trust website or the Business Environment and Innovation website as well, the government one. And the links to that are actually in the guide as well. So, as I say, they already have the data in many cases. Most people have to keep their bills for several years for tax purposes. It used to be 7, I don't know whether it's 7 anymore, but certainly they have to retain some sort of image of an invoice in order to keep the taxman happy for some years. So I think the other thing to say is that this is a partnership. Carbon reduction can't just be done by suppliers without the universities actually contributing as well. So, you know, if you think about the fact that maybe you don't schedule your deliveries into your university and you've got suppliers, you know, delivering 5 days a week, sometimes more than once a day, then that in itself is a carbon footprint. So maybe if you could schedule your deliveries with a particular supplier to 1 day a week or 2 days a week, that would reduce the carbon footprint, reduce the fuel used. Maybe you could think about consolidating orders so that they use less packaging with particular suppliers. Maybe you could think about a central hub for deliveries off-site so that they don't come into the campus and then you use electric vehicles to ship them in and distribute them yourself. Obviously that's a cost, but you know, I have to say, if you had a central goods inwards department, you would massively reduce your invoice queries overnight and you would be able to measure on-time delivery. But yeah, I appreciate that's a cost, but that might be something that you know, you might you know, the cost of everything that you're dealing with in terms of queries, etc., might outweigh the costs of actually creating your own goods inwards and reducing your carbon footprint. But that's probably beyond me or you. You would certainly need support from other parties in the university for that. But there are things you can do in terms of scheduling delivery and consolidating orders so that you look at the packaging. Also talking to your suppliers about reduced packaging or reusable packaging in some way. So some of the suggestions, and I know there's a lot on that page, but I did cut and paste it from the guidance that we've created. So obviously there's things like electrifying your fleet, reducing business travel is an easy one, embracing virtual meetings. Well, you know, to be fair, you know, we've all done that within the university sector over the last year and a half, and I'm sure we've massively reduced our carbon footprint as a result. And that's one of the reasons why I am suggesting to people that, you know, don't base it on the last 2 years. If you do a carbon reduction plan, base it on 2019, because that was your way of working then, and that was the normality of life then. And therefore you will immediately see a benefit if you measure where you are today, hopefully. So things like making electric charging points available, fixing delivery schedules, things like insulation, think about flexible workplaces, hot desking, remote working to reduce emissions, LED lighting, buying green or renewable energy for your building. Not as easy these days, since so many of them have gone down in recent times, but it is getting better. You know, think about solar panels, smart meters, central energy management, and you know, we all work in offices where we've got people that are hot and people that are cold, but unfortunately that in itself is wasteful of energy, and you know, it is better to have some sort of central management of temperature, obviously, in offices. Look at reducing the energy used in the IT server room. You know, if you can put more on cloud storage, then obviously you don't need to run servers yourself, and you don't need to keep a room cool as well. Think about plastics use, reduce printing, all sorts of things. And you know, one of the things that I try and encourage people to do is to reuse as often as possible. So don't always necessarily think about buying something new. Can you reuse it? Can you repair it? That's probably because I'm an old timer, and I remember that you know, my mother used to have a washing machine that lasted 20 years, and they don't these days. so I do myself try to get things repaired, and would like to see that translated into life. So the UK UPC, they did some question and answers by the Sustainable Development Goals. These are the questions that they had in there against climate action, which was number 13 in the SDGs. I'm not saying that they're the best questions in the world, but you know, they could be a starting point for you. But also, if you look on the UK UPC website, or if you look on our website, you'll also see some model answers which will help you evaluate those questions as well. So you'll know what good should look like. The HE TOMs, you may have picked up a news item from ourselves that we have been working on the HE TOMs, and particularly, you know, I have to give a shout out to Rachel Devaney at Sheffield Hallam, who's been very active in it, and also Liz Tidswell as well. But what we've done, the TOMs are themes, themes, I can't forget, themes, options and measurements. And basically these were developed by the Social Value Portal and originally the local authorities in the UK, and basically they wanted to come up with some measurements to identify the value of the contribution that their purchasers were making to the local community. And so they came up with a set of TOMs, and basically it creates a value. The supplier fills it in. He says, you know, I've got an extra person. I'm going to employ an extra person as a result of this contract. So he puts one in, and that gives a value, a social value to the contract of, say, £36,000. And it's an evaluation tool. It can be used for contract management, but it's also used to obviously demonstrate your social value. So what I'm showing you here is some of the questions round environmental issues that are available, and it very much is a pick and choose scenario. So you choose which ones are relevant for you and which ones you wish to evaluate as part of the tender. And so, you know, as part of your 10% sustainability, you would probably include this. And, you know, the supplier that obviously offers the highest environmental support on this particular section would get a higher mark than somebody that has scored particularly low on it. And the questions are designed so that hopefully it doesn't favour the big boys. They should be things that it's an opportunity for everybody to work on. There will be a formal launch of the HE TOMs. We've done a soft launch so far. It is a spreadsheet that is available for you to use in an evaluation tool, but we're just waiting for the social value portal to do a proper launch. And there will be some webinars, I would think, early next year on the HE TOMs. So finally, the net positive action plan. Obviously, within the next net positive action plan, oops, sorry, I just dipped out. Am I back again? Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So basically, the sustainability action plan, I don't know if you've ever tried to create one yourself on net positive, but basically it comes up with some key criteria under sort of ethical, under environmental, under equality and diversity, under modern slavery. It comes up with a whole gambit of what we recognise as being responsible procurement or sustainability today. And it will ask them to identify whether they recognise that as an issue for their business, and it will then come up with a number of different options that they could work on to improve this issue that they've currently got problems with, and they can select one of those, or they can create their own solution if they're already working on something. So it does very much make suggestions to them of how they can improve things, and that obviously that action plan can be used to talk to suppliers in contract management about what they've done and what they haven't done. There is something like about 8 or 9 options against the sort of carbon reduction initiatives. So they have got plenty of things to drive them that way. And obviously, the reporting now is much easier on net positives. So you can obviously change this qualitative data into quantitative data. So you could look and say, how many suppliers have identified that carbon reduction is an issue for them, and how many have already undertaken actions on it or completed actions on it. So you can use it as a bit of a reporting tool as well. It's not true data. You are moving qualitative data into quantitative data, but it's still worthwhile data, and it tells a story of the fact that people are working on carbon reduction or other initiatives such as modern slavery, etc. So there are lots and lots of resources. I was overwhelmed by the number of resources that were available on the internet. And I've always said that Google is my best friend, but honestly, it's your supplier's best friend as well, and particularly the Carbon Trust, the WWF, which is not the wrestling people, it's the World Wildlife Fund. The business playbooks that are now available. There's the 1.5 degrees centigrade business playbook, which is very useful. There is a free e-learning module on FutureLearn, which is about how to measure, reduce and offset your company's carbon footprint. And obviously we can add to this as we go along. If we do find some free carbon literacy training, then we can do that. But I think for the moment, point them down the FutureLearn scenario. But there are some very, very useful resources out there. So that is me for today. I'm going to see thank you and any questions, but I am going to turn the recording off first. Just hold on. Stop recording.